A very warm welcome to the first of the Koinonia Seminars of this new academic year, which are hosted by Westminster Abbey in collaboration with the Diocese of London. These seminars exist to bring to the wider public some of the latest in theological research, theological, ecclesiological, interfaith, and to hear from a diversity of speakers from across the world on some of the work that they're doing. Today, we are delighted in particular to welcome Dr. Nadia Marais, who is a senior lecturer in systematic theology at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, and is also an ordained minister in the Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa. Nadia is a Mandela Rhodes Scholar, and she is currently a visiting scholar at Princeton Theological Seminary, and also a fellow of the Centre of Theological Inquiry at Princeton. We're delighted to have Nadia with us today. She is going to speak to us about human flourishing. She has a recent book out on this topic, and the title of her presentation for us today is Speaking of Human Flourishing, Salvation, Happiness, Rhetoric. You'll be able to join us in asking questions to Nadia at the end of this seminar. So please make sure that you write your questions in the chat, in the comments section of the website. You need to be signed into YouTube to do this. And I'll pose your questions to Nadia after she has spoken. But for now, Nadia, it's wonderful to have you with us this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us from Princeton. And we look forward to hearing you on Speaking of Human Flourishing, Salvation, Happiness, Rhetoric.
Thank you, Jamie. And just from my side, also, thank you for the invitation and for this opportunity to share something of what has interested me for the last 10 years or so. It's really wonderful to participate also in this way. I think that the topic of happiness and human flourishing, human thriving, however one wants to sort of define it, is something that is extremely popular at the moment, also in academia. So we know that in especially psychology and positive psychology, to be more specific, with the publication of Martin Seligman's Flourish in his earlier book on authentic happiness, the conversation across academic disciplines has really exploded on how we understand what human flourishing is. And I think I can talk in more detail about some examples from various disciplines, but let me focus on theology to say that theologians have also come to engage this conversation. It was interesting to me to see that in some ways this is very much a modern and contemporary conversation, perhaps fairly recent. This renewed interest in the topic of happiness and flourishing. But in many other ways, it really actually is a very old conversation. And so if we look back into our own faith traditions, we'll find figures like St. Augustine who would engage this self-same topic and really try to figure out, what does a Christian doctrine of happiness look like? I think here a good example of a theologian that has brought the topic to the table is that of Princeton theologian Ellen Cherry, with her book God and the Art of Happiness. I think it was published in 2011, where she sought to work out a doctrine of happiness and to engage Augustine and other theologians on this question of how should we understand happiness? How can we be happy? What does the Christian faith offer in terms of helping us to live lives of wisdom, lives of virtue, knowing, loving, and enjoying God. And so this is a wonderful and a wonderfully rich conversation also amongst, I think, theologians. Also interesting just to maybe say that the project that I am participating here in Princeton at the CTI on is exactly on this topic, thriving in diverse contexts. So clearly this is a very important conversation, and theologians are engaging this in different ways. I think in systematic theology, which is my discipline, and with a focus on doctrines, it's fascinating to me to see how people approach this conversation. And in my own work, I have sought to approach it from soteriology, or the doctrine of salvation. And my argument has been, and my interest, or the question that I've engaged really is, what shapes our language of human flourishing? So, on a perhaps more surface level, what is the vocabulary that we use, the theological vocabulary? So what is the riches of our traditions offer us in shaping how we speak about what happiness and flourishing is? Are there certain ways of speaking that is perhaps more damaging, that we need to sort of be aware of? And there are theologians that have been very critical, and that have pointed out some of these dangers, and I might mention some of these a little bit later. Are there ways that, or ways of speaking that can sort of enrich the academic conversation, so where theologians and Christians can actually participate and help to deepen reflection on what it means to be happy? And so these are the kinds of questions that I think that are really important on a surface level. In other words, the vocabulary. So do we speak about piety? Do we use sort of synonymous concepts like being fully alive, or blessedness, grace even? And so on the one hand, but my own interest has also been on another level to say, I think that the conversation on a perhaps more surface level, as important as that is, to be clear about what we mean and we don't mean, ways of speaking that are life-giving and perhaps less so, is also the interest in grammar. So perhaps one can describe it as the language game at play in our choices of rhetoric and our choices of concepts and vocabulary. So what shapes on a deeper level, perhaps you can say at the DNA level, our speaking as Christians about this topic? And so in my own work, I have proposed, and I think it's by no means a sort of final argument, definitely open to more reflection and to thinking about the more that the tradition can also offer. But I've proposed that I think in at least modern or contemporary theology, there are at least 3 discourses, probably many more, that shape our speaking on human flourishing. And these are, I focused on soteriological discourses, or discourses on the doctrine of salvation, because we find the language, if we think of biblical texts, which is not my expertise, but if we think of the Psalms, for instance, or the Beatitudes, the language of flourishing and blessedness, it's everywhere. Once you are sort of open to encountering that kind of rhetoric in our own texts, in the tradition, we really encounter it in so many places. I can perhaps just mention one small example of this. It's in the Beatitudes, the Greek word makarios. And now there's this wonderful translation in one of the Afrikaans Bible translations, which is my home language, the oldest Afrikaans Bible translation dating from 1933, where they translate this word with a word that actually encompasses 3 concepts, and all 3 of them wonderfully rich concepts that allude to this link between happiness and salvation. And the word is welgeluk salig. So wel, having the connotation of well-being, which I think is perhaps also clear in the English. Geluk, which is perhaps closer to the German, which is the word for happiness in Afrikaans, but also has connotations of luck. I think a historian like Darren McMahon, in his very rich overview of happiness, entitled Happiness, a History, pointed out these etymological links also between happiness and luck in some of these wordings. And then also the word salig. Seligkeit, we can think of again the German, but also salus, the wholeness, salvation. And so well-being, happiness, salvation, all encompassed in or encapsulated in this one word that's used in the translation of makarios. And so there are these very interesting rhetorical links. And I've been interested in how do we choose certain words. So, for instance, flourishing but not thriving, or perhaps not happiness, because it sounds for many people too glib, too superficial, but perhaps fully alive. So how do we come to make these choices about the options that are on the table? And so in my argument, I've looked at 3 discourses on salvation, and I've entitled them Salvation is Reconciliation, where I've looked at 3 theologians, and at least in my own arguments, sought to point out that, this reflection starts with early modernity, so with John Calvin, and the concept of piety. I've also included in this first discourse Friedrich Schleiermacher, who's widely regarded as the father of modern theology, and the concept of joy, especially in his fiction, his work of fiction, Christmas Eve, or the Christmas Dialogue, which is a wonderful book also to read, and a South African theologian by the name of Willie Jonker, who worked a lot with the concept of troos, or comfort, consolation. And in this first discourse on salvation as reconciliation, I've argued that it is the logic, which I've called the soteriological logic of faith, that is shaping the choice of language, where the focus is very much on the effects of the doctrine of justification, but also the relationship between justification and sanctification. This really is an argument that I sustain throughout this broader in the book, which is based on my doctoral dissertation. And so I've tried to point out that the choice of language is embedded in how the relationship between justification and sanctification within this understanding of salvation or soteriology is sort of described or positioned. A second discourse that I've outlined that I think is an enormously important discourse, especially in conversations between liberation theologians, feminist theologians, African theologians, on justice and human dignity and so on. I've called it Salvation as Liberation, shaped by an eschatological logic of hope. And here theologians like the father of liberation theology, Gustavo Gutierrez, is one of the figures. And I found the concept of being fully alive very interesting in his work, that for him, salvation has to do with communion with one another, communion with God. The mother of African women's theology, Mercy Odioye, and her concept of healing, of being healthy and healed, but in an encompassing sense, not, I think, perhaps in some of the very limiting ways that we often think of health and healing as physical or even mental health, but also health in the sense of relational healing and communal health in Odioye's thinking. And then third theologian that I think has helped us enormously in this discourse is the South African theologian Russell Botman, Black Reformed theologian, also the first Black rector of Stellenbosch University, where I teach, for whom the concept of human dignity has played a very central and key role. Also, I mean, one of the 3 major sort of values that shape our constitution in South Africa. So I think Botman's notion of dignity is also a way of reflecting thriving, what it means to thrive, be happy, live a full life, live a good life. So that is a second discourse. And then as a third discourse, I've proposed that we think of salvation as transformation. And here, women theologians that have engaged this topic of flourishing and happiness have been very helpful to me in my reflection on this. I think here the logic that, or the way in which I've described the logic, at least, and I'm open to critique and other proposals, but has been to describe this as a creative logic of love, where we see that sanctification forms the sort of central focus in these portrayals of salvation. So Serene Jones, the American feminist theologian, with her notion of grace and graced human beings, I think is particularly important here. Ellen Cherry, I've already referred to, and the book really is, I think, kind of watershed in the modern conversation on the modern theological conversation on happiness and flourishing, and her notion then specifically of happiness, Also the sort of more difficult aspects to this conversation, I think, which she also raises in her book. If we think of, can we flourish in adversity? Can we flourish while we are sick and living with pain? Can we flourish while dying? Can we flourish in poverty? I think these are some of the most important conversations that theologians are engaging, including Achari, but also many others. But also, of course, some of the most difficult. And then the third and last theologian that I found helpful in this discourse is the South African feminist theologian, Denise Ackerman. And she wrote a last book was on sort of contemporary beatitudes or blessing, which I've also found really, really helpful in this argument. And so, taken together, what I've found interesting, and this is my proposal at a sort of deeper level. So, on a vocabulary level, we have a rich array of concepts: piety, joy, comfort, fully alive, healing, dignity, grace or graced, happiness and blessing. But is that these various logics, and especially within these logics, how the relationship between justification and sanctification is portrayed, that these ultimately shape where the emphasis fall in our reflection on flourishing. So is it a more sort of internal focus? Is it more personal, focus on the individual? So on a kind of response to sin and evil, to our human misery, which I think is typical of the first discourse. Is there a bit of a broader focus informed by also situations of injustice, concerns for human dignity and equality, as we find in the second discourse, where there is still an important reflection on justification present, but the emphasis seems to shift to sanctification, what it means to live as human beings that are sanctified, living towards holiness, called towards living lives of virtue. And so I think that is perhaps in the second discourse important. And then in the third discourse, the focus shifts even more towards sanctification. There I've argued that some of these theologians, and here someone like Serene Jones is a good example, actually turn the order of justification and sanctification around, where they argue that perhaps the time has come for us to reflect on salvation from the primary position of sanctification. And very interesting reasons also for that I won't go into right now. But together, these three logics, so faith, hope, love, I think come to shape also our grammar or our rhetoric theologically of flourishing and of happiness, however one would describe that. I think that it is important at this point to also mention that there are some very real and I think legitimate theological concerns that should also help us discern what might not be helpful in the conversation on what is happiness, how do we, what makes for thriving, for flourishing, not only our own flourishing, but also that of our neighbors. And here, a theologian that has been very helpful to me is the Yale theologian, so American Reformed theologian David Kelsey, who, to my mind and in my what I've encountered in the literature, actually provides the best sort of overview and engagement with the rhetoric of flourishing, including what is not helpful. Once again, in my view, but he's pointed out to the dangers of certain words and the etymological assumptions behind certain words. So he's very critical, for instance, about the word thrive, or thriving, which comes from the Norse word thrifask, and notions of growing luxuriantly. And he has in mind here the sort of damaging manifestations of the prosperity gospel with its associations with flourishing and health and wealth. So, and we in South Africa, and I think in many parts of the world, we see the effects of how damaging rhetorics of human flourishing can also be. So this is not a sort of benign, innocent, superficial conversation I think in many ways it cannot be that, because especially if it is rooted in how we view salvation, and shaped by our soteriologies, our doctrines of salvation, we need to be also very mindful of the ways in which it can overpromise and underdeliver, but even in a deeper sense, cause misery, contribute to injustice, create expectations for people who are dealing with suffering, with pain, people who are dying. When we think about sort of in South Africa, of course, we are probably the most unequal society in terms of wealth distribution. So how do we speak about flourishing in a way that is also, that has integrity, and that engages the real life experiences of people, not in a glib manner or in a superficial manner, not in a way that offers the opiate to the people, so it just sort of numbs the pain, but really articulates the comfort of the gospel. And here I think someone like Kelsey helps us with that as well, to really calls us to do better, than offer superficial comforts, from the Bible, from the tradition. And so the warnings that the ways in which we think about flourishing as wealth, that and health as well, that these links is perhaps not always that helpful. And so we need to also be mindful, is Kelsey's point, of the language that we do use, because this is not just language. This is what people sort of, put their hopes on. This is what, for many people, articulates their deepest comfort, because it is rooted in the gospel. It is rooted in what they view their salvation is, so I think in many ways this is an extremely important conversation. So we have I think these various options that theologians offer us, and I can perhaps just say in my work right now, because the study was also limited, I am also pursuing some of the older voices and impulses in our Christian faith traditions, especially since I'm Reformed, the Reformed faith tradition. But I think the realization that this very old conversation, once again referring to Augustine, which I'm working on Augustine right now, so this is kind of in the forefront of my mind when I think about some of the older impulses that shape this rhetoric, or this conversation, for theologians today. That we have so many wonderful examples of how theologians would engage the conversation of their day. If we think of Augustine engaging the philosophical schools of his day, using what he finds helpful, but also in a way reshaping what these schools would offer. So in terms of working out a doctrine of happiness, or a view of what it means to flourish, to be saved, and I think that I don't want to say that job, but that calling, or that invitation, is also an invitation that lies in front of us today, not only for us as theologians, but for all Christians, to think about the ways in which we arrange, I think, our economies, our political sort of setup, our democracies. Are these not all ways in which to sort of maximize well-being, the well-being of citizens, the well-being of consumers, and what can theology and theologians, Christian faith, offer within these many competing claims and many competing sort of offers and suggestions for what flourishing is and how to achieve it. So, but I think that this conversation is in a way also very much open. And once again, we see this across disciplines, not only in psychology, but as I mentioned, in economics, in political science, in philosophy, of course, and other disciplines as well. And so the work of thinking through what flourishing is and what makes for flourishing. So what are the commitments that we need for flourishing for the most people, and especially for the most vulnerable, should be made possible. These are the kinds of questions that that are on the table, but perhaps should even be engaged more seriously and more urgently. I think if we think of where we are right now in terms of world news and sort of news of wars and just I think so many examples that one can use, the urgency behind considering what flourishing entails, and what possibly the Christian faith can also offer, not as a final answer, definitely not as the answer, but I think perhaps also as a conversation partner that can and should be taken seriously. I think that is on the table definitely at the moment, and will probably be so in increasingly in the future. I can perhaps just sort of share a last thought as part of my initial input for now, and once again from Kelsey, but also the Canadian feminist philosopher Grace Jansen. So Kelsey makes the point that for us to flourish, he says, our neighbors also need to flourish. And he uses two, I think, wonderful images, certainly wonderful images for a theologian from Stellenbosch, from the winelands, so it's wine country, and also being a wine drinker myself. So he uses the metaphors of bearing fruit and bearing seed. And for me, it opens the way of talking about these logics in these discourses as cultivars. So cultivating the fruit. So the ways in which we can be a blessing to our contemporary neighbors. So the people around us here and now, in our space, in this time, how can we sort of, the kinds of choices we make now, how can we act or not act, refrain from acting, that enables the flourishing of others. So because our flourishing is deeply connected and determined by the flourishing of our neighbors. And here I would like to think that we include also our non-human neighbors, and also think of animals and sort of the environment and so on. But then he also uses the metaphor of seed, bearing seed. And the idea here for him is that we should be a blessing to our future neighbors. So possibly those generations that we will never know and that will never know us. But how do we make choices here and now? And I think a good example here is climate change, actually, so that future generations have food to eat, clean water to drink, clean air to breathe. So places to live, that are relatively safe. I mean, just within the past week, this hurricane came through Florida, which didn't come as far north as New Jersey, of course, but really set me thinking also, what are the choices we make now so that in 50 years' time, in 100 years' time, we also enable people to flourish. And I think these two are really helpful metaphors and anchoring points for us in thinking through what it means to flourish. But then a third image, and I want to end with this, comes from Grace Jansen, and she connects flourishing with its etymological root, the Latin word florere, which means to blossom. So here we can think of flowers, and in a way, all of these metaphors are agricultural, botanical metaphors, but it is displaying the beauty that a given life is capable of. So it has to do with being a blessing towards others, but it also has to do with beauty. So, and I think I find that really fascinating and just energizing. This invitation to that flourishing and thinking through what it means to flourish and not to flourish, and how we should speak about flourishing and not speak about flourishing, ultimately has to do with a commitment to beauty. So if we say salvation is not just about the sort of more sinister aspects of our faith, so being free from our sin, being comforted or consoled, some kind of a response to the misery that we are born into, which is of course a key term in our many of our creeds and confessions. We can think of the Heidelberg Catechism, but also has to do with being called and drawn into beauty. So not just the sort of minimum concerns of upholding human dignity, the human dignity of people, which requires a kind of minimum standard, of a kind of, you need at least this minimum wage in order to survive or live a human life, access to medical health care and so on, which is of course crucial. That's absolutely important. But also a conversation that continues from there to say, well, what is required for people to flourish, to live a life that is characterized by fullness, by communion, by joy, and ultimately also by beauty. So I think these images of bearing fruit, bearing seed, and flowering are helpful in opening the conversation even further, also within our churches and in our congregations, to invite imaginings and images for what it means to flourish. And I think I'm going to stop there for now, just so that I don't talk your ears off your head.
Thank you, Nadia, so much. What a great place to finish. And thinking of happiness and flourishing as being so intrinsically linked to our neighbour, but also linked into concepts of fruition and even of wine. This is very beautiful. Friends who are joining us online, feel free, please, to type your questions into the chat, which I will then pose to Nadia on your behalf. I'm going to kick off by asking Nadia how, in your own thinking, this sense of happiness and flourishing being focused on salvation relates to more metaphysical concepts such as ecstasy, bliss. How do you see the relationship between our happiness on earth in a fallen world being related to those concepts of ecstasy and bliss that perhaps characterize the divine in a particular way?
Yeah. Well, that is a wonderful question. I'll have to think about it a little bit, to be honest with you. But I think those are definitely concepts that I haven't considered yet. And I'd really be interested in exploring that. I think that the work of someone like Hans Urs von Balthasar, the glory of God, that there's so much more to explore. So one of the things I realized just, when I finished the study was just how absolutely limited it is. So it was wonderful for me to read all these different theologians. And in my case, I sought to end with a South African theologian in each of these discourses, so to anchor it in a way also in Stellenbosch, all of them taught at Stellenbosch. But one of the things I realized as I finished was there's definitely at least a fourth discourse, contemporary discourse, on sort of perhaps an orthodox focus on glory, I think perhaps also bliss, that I haven't considered, and that definitely needs to be part of this conversation. So thank you. So it would definitely be interesting to, from my sort of gut reaction, and I might be completely wrong, I suspect that it would be a wonderful addition in terms of the focus on sanctification.
Yeah.
Because this is for me, this was interesting, is that I think, this is my proposal, at a depth level, that the grammars of flourishing are shaped by, if we work from the doctrine of salvation, of course, are shaped by the dynamic between justification and sanctification. So in a way, the order, although many theologians are not comfortable with working with an order of salutis anymore. But how this dynamic works, is certainly part of the conversation. I can perhaps just also say what has been really helpful in terms of the broader logic of this project, and I'd like to think about how bliss and ecstasy would work within this constructive proposal, because definitely I think it's important. Um, so Russell Boltman had this very interesting idea where um, he proposed that faith, hope, and love, he said, are not static concepts. So he's referring to was Paul, and but he was suggesting that in each new sort of time and spirit of the times, one of these three concepts, and these remain connected to each other, so none of them have meaning apart from the others, but we spoke about a rotating triad. So they're not a fixed triangle with love always being at the top. But instead, he said, so in the Reformation, if you think of Martin Luther, faith would be a major focus. And more recently, he referred to Martin Luther King, and in his own work, he argued hope. Hope is probably so. This is a triad that is dynamic and constantly moving, and I think this might also help in considering, how our rhetorics of flourishing work. That these are not static concepts. That we sort of say, okay, we've moved on from piety, we won't return there. It's old. It's kind of dated. And maybe people don't like that word so much. So we'll stick with grace and happiness and perhaps bliss and ecstasy, but how we sort of excavate, I think, do the work of excavating very rich notions that 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 this understanding of the logics that can also change in response to the dynamics of our time and the needs and the sort of the challenges of our times and of our specific context, because of course that also changes if we look specifically, it's South African context. I think at the moment the question of hope is enormously important. But even last year we had this year our general elections, the question of love. How do we sort of live as citizens? So I think all of these notions are constantly in play and in a dynamic sense on the table. So, but that is a wonderful question, Jamie. I definitely like to think about it.
Thank you. And I mean, perhaps these categories of what I might call categories of excess,
Yeah.
bliss, ecstasy, help. Maybe they can become sort of macro categories because of their relationship, their obvious relationship to eternity, to the nature of God, even. But look, there are a couple of other questions coming in. One question here about the idea of flourishing for people in pain, people living in poverty, was avoiding the dangers and indeed the heresy of the prosperity gospel. And what kind of language, what kind of concepts do you use in this context? I should say that question is by a colleague who does a lot of work in very poor parts of the world.
Yeah.
What sort of language and concepts can you use in that context?
Yeah. That is probably one of the most difficult questions, I think, and most important questions that is and should be on the table with this conversation. So the way in which I in my book I pointed out that there are, I think, 4 major critiques against this this focus on flourishing, and of course this is one. And I think the interesting thing here, I've sought to try and understand it as a relationship between doctrines. So I know this is very much a practical question, a human life experience question, pastoral question, really. But I think it is also a question that needs to be taken seriously by systematic theologians in terms of how we view doctrine and reflect these pastoral concerns back into our portrayals of salvation. I think that here the tension is between the doctrine of salvation and the doctrine of providence. So, I mean, the very classic questions related to theodicy. What does God allow human suffering or evil? Why does God not intervene? And so I'm very aware of the fact that these questions are bigger than what so human flourishing and the focus on this is not a quick fix. It's not going to just provide, it shouldn't, even if it wants to provide easy answers to that question. I think what has helped me, and it's not a definitely not a perfect answer, but what has helped me is to really take seriously the voices of liberation and African and feminist theologians. So theologians also from the global south, and to sort of follow their lead. And I think here people like, so in the second discourse that I've discussed, this has been really important, like Gustavo Gutierrez in his book on theology of liberation. Also, I mean, of course, Mercy Orioye, who talks a lot about the poverty of African women, which, in a way, African women's theology is focused in a very specific way, because here there are experiences of oppression, not just based on gender, as in feminist theology, not just based on gender and race, as in womanist theology, so American womanist theology, but really on three factors. So triple oppressive system, also economic status and employment and so on. So arguing that African women are the poorest of the poor in Africa. So and so her argument is that even within this broader world of feminist and womanist theology, there is a need for reflection on the specific experiences. And I think taking the lead from theologians who work, from specific sort of questions and experiences, that is probably the best way to go. The one thing I can say about I think all of us can probably cite examples, damaging sort of examples of prosperity theologies that really sort of, it's everything. It really is a distortion of the gospel, as the person also said, a heresy. But also in South Africa, we really struggle, I think, in many ways with this, the promises of health and wealth. I think sometimes the church then becomes a kind of pyramid scheme, where you are sort of bankrolled by people that you recruit, and often these are the people that are most desperate. So and all this wealth and everything goes to figure eight, pastor or whatever. So I'm not sure what a good answer to that would be, because I think in a sense there isn't an answer that has integrity, sort of one size fits all answer. But I do think what is interesting to me to observe from people like Gustavo Gutierrez, Mercy Orioye, Russell Botman, is that on the one hand, salvation and the gospel somehow remains important. So there's a moment of not letting go of the gospel, but on the other hand, of course, a critical engagement, but also that there's something once again of beauty, of a reminder of human dignity that is encapsulated in what the Christian faith tradition could possibly offer. I think the challenge is probably the responsibility lies squarely on, I think, the shoulders of Christians and theologians, church leaders, not to abuse the positive potential and the sort of that is embedded in the gospel, but to also reflect, reflect the complexities of what this offers, because it does offer comfort and consolation. And I can perhaps just say, I in terms of health and wealth, I used to be very dismissive of these links with flourishing until a colleague, actually, who is an American Pentecostal theologian, asked me, said, but has the gospel not also led churches to build schools and to build hospitals and to, is there not also a kind of way in which the gospel positively offers opportunities to better health and wealth? And that really made me think and realize maybe I should also be more open in terms of, so not justifying in any way the damages that the prosperity gospels cause, and the misery that they cause, but also that the connections to health and wealth might be more complex than I would like to believe. And maybe I should be more open to learn about those positive and constructive connections. Maybe that's something where some answers could lie. I don't know.
That's really interesting and really challenging. I'm so grateful that you've grounded what you said there in reflection again on the liberationists, and Gutierrez's sense that salvation is communion is, I think, really helpful here. Communion can be translated in so many different ways, can't it? Salvation and solidarity in situations of terrible pain, terrible abuse, without instrumentalizing either pain or abuse, but saying that there is something blessed about the solidarity that people enjoy, and I use that word in the formal sense, that people enjoy between one another in situations even of great trauma. We know that from so many witnesses themselves. But just moving on to another question, which is actually sort of in this area. This relates to some of the language, Nadia, that you used towards the end of your presentation about harvesting, blossoming, those metaphors. One questioner says, could you say a bit more about the death of the seed in the process of blossoming?
Wow.
Very beautifully put.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that, to be honest with you. So yeah, that is an excellent question. Well, I think that, what I'm realizing also here, this project that we are engaged with here, is that one of the sort of, I think, major questions on the table is how we speak about thriving or flourishing and trauma. So, and here also death. So to link up to this question, for me, again, David Kelsey has been just a really wonderful sort of guide along the way of theological reflection and seeking to understand. He, for instance, makes the relationship between living, life, flourishing, and death, dying, a little bit more complex. So he argues that it's not the sort of very obvious and maybe even banal sort of just, death against life, but rather the challenge of living a, a dying life. So he contrasts living death, which he describes as living against your own grain, living in misery. So, which theology has so much to say about. Again, our creeds and confessions, I think, articulate this really well. But he says the challenge is not to try and avoid death and dying, but to live into the reality, our created reality, that we are, as living beings, we are finite and therefore dying lives. To, in a way, also embrace that. And this is always a difficult conversation, because no one can sort of tell someone who is dying to embrace it. So this is always a very personal reflecting back on my own death, my own life as a dying life. But I've always found that really helpful, so that it's, in other words, possible to flourish as dying lives, as those who are perhaps already cells already dying off and so on, but people who will come to an end. And this is exactly how we flourish. So this is not the opposite of flourishing, or we shouldn't try to avoiding death is not the way to flourish, to sort of put it over in an oversimplified way, but really to embrace, live into being dying lives. But again, the connection to the moment one connects it to theodicy, to suffering, and to oppression. And I can perhaps just say one more word about that in my my third discourse. This was interesting to me, even comparing women theologians who are very much engaged in this conversation on flourishing and happiness. For instance, Serene Jones and Ellen Cherry actually follow different pathways into what the opposite of flourishing is, which is also an important conversation. So what is flourishing not? What is, I don't know, you can maybe call it human withering, whatever. And so people or theologians would describe it in various ways. Some would say that oppression is the opposite of flourishing. Others would say that suffering is the opposite of flourishing. But however one sort of defines it, I think that that dealing with the theology of death and the theology of trauma is absolutely crucial in this endeavor. Once again, to work out and work with theologies of flourishing that are helpful, that is sort of comforting, that both, incidentally, David Kelsey and Ellen Cherry argue that Christian doctrine should be pastoral, which I've always also found really helpful. So it's not just an endeavor to try and work out, and people often have this picture of systematic theologians being overly rational and logical and really actually in a way boring and just not in touch with human life and pleasures and challenges and just everyday practical stuff. And I've always found that really interesting and just a wonderful, that for them thinking through doctrine should have pastoral implications. It should help people to actually live, and to think through things and work with difficult things and questions and circumstances. And so I think in a way that would be the best kind of systematic theology we could do, is to also reflect on death, dying, and trauma. So thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. Just thinking about this sense of happiness, flourishing, being part of living into death. I remember the first time I ever saw an Orthodox schema in one of the very big monasteries in Russia. The highest degree of Eastern monasticism, the schema monks, the schema nuns, who've reached the highest level of spiritual awareness. And of course, they walk around in the black monastic dress, but wearing on the front of their habit the symbols of the Passion, often with a skull and crossbones at the bottom. I remember the first time I saw this, thinking, how does all this fit together? This wonderful Christian religious tradition, which is about deification, about sanctification, and yet those who are the most intensely involved at the highest levels of the spiritual life wear symbols of death and passion on their clothes, and of course the passion itself, in a sense, of ultimate bliss. All these contradictions that are shot through the linguistic expressions of our faith. Thank you. I'm just looking at questions. I'm going to ask another question, if I may, to conclude, just Nadia, quite quickly, if we may.
Yeah.
Just think about contemporary uses of concepts of happiness in the world today. I think particularly of Western concepts of quick fix happiness.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any words, for example, that you think we simply should not use? Are there any that we might call, for a very sloppy secular shorthand, secular expressions of happiness that are particularly troubling to you?
Another great question. So much depends on what is unsaid. And I think that's the wonderful thing about rhetorical theology. It's trying to make clear what our assumptions are about certain words, why we hold to these, and not just, again, on a sort of surface level, the vocabulary, but on a deeper sort of level, also the grammar, the sort of language game.
Mm.
So in a sense, I think it would be a sad state of affairs if we would dismiss concepts because of our unarticulated assumptions or about them.
Mm.
I can perhaps just use another one of another example of my own closed-mindedness to illustrate this project that we are a part of. We read psychological science. And one of the things I realized is that theologians are extremely critical of the concept of well-being for a number of reasons. And this stretches across, Jürgen Moltmann, Karl Barth, so many, David Kelsey. There is an array of theologians that are really skeptical of its link to health. And this idea of health and healing being free of sickness. which, is problematic because who is ever completely free of pain and sickness? But the one thing I realized was that perhaps this is a concept that theologians need to re-engage and not too easily dismiss, because in psychological science, subjective well-being, psychological well-being, eudaimonic well-being, hedonic well-being, these are absolutely key words in positive psychology and in reflecting through flourishing and happiness and so on. And so that it's really been interesting to me to re-engage this concept over against my own sort of hesitancy and I think critique. And when I thought through it really carefully, I thought, well, why can the concept not be redeemed? Why, we can be aware of the criticism and what can potentially be problematic, but we can also do the work, the sort of constructive, imaginative work, the work of beauty and art, of portraying it in other ways. So I think that is perhaps part of the challenge of a rhetoric of human flourishing, theological rhetoric of human flourishing, is work that we need to do in our own imaginations to say, but maybe there are more words that we've easily discarded already that we sort of need to re-invite back into the conversation and re-engage. So it would be difficult to, off the bat, I think, just say these words. Words like thriving, for instance, is another one that's not very popular amongst theologians. But again, the question would be, but, also with a view towards interdisciplinary conversation, how do we also speak the language of other disciplines in a way that we can make an exchange of gifts possible? We are open to learn and offer something hopefully in return. So so it's a fascinating question. I'll think about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm really struck, Nadia, at the end there by, what you say about the need for theology to be an integrative discipline, to listen to other disciplines, to not dismiss concepts too swiftly, because they may, as we know from the gospel, possibly have the pearl hidden within them. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. Thank you for fitting us into your schedule whilst you're at the Centre for Theological Inquiry with family life and so on. We're really grateful to you for this fascinating, rich, wide-ranging discussion. Thank you. Friends, the next Koinonia seminar, actually via happy providence, extends something of this theme when we welcome Professor Paul Gavrilyuk, who is a very distinguished Eastern Orthodox theologian, currently the Aquinas Chair in Theology and Philosophy at the University of St. Thomas, St. Paul in Minnesota, who is going to speak to us about Eastern theologies of deification. His seminar title is Making Deification Real, the Goal of Christian Life in Eastern Christianity. This seminar is on the 12th of November online at 1 p.m. And if you're able to join us, we'd be delighted. Please sign up via the website in the usual way. In the meantime, thank you once again to all of you for joining us for this rich discussion this afternoon, and to Dr. Nadia Marais for being willing to lead us. Thank you very much.